Hi, good afternoon or morning, everyone. Happy late morning. Is this on? Yes. Can folks hear me in the back okay? Good, okay, good. Hi, everyone. I just want to make sure. Okay, there. So my name is Nathan Lachowsky, and I will be moderating this session, but we are really all colleagues and peers on the panel, so I'm just assuming everyone will be very respectful of the time. But if I have to show you the red card, I will show you the red card. I think that we also might have some slides on automatic change, so that'll be interesting. I'll just change that. I'm going to change that really quickly. So while I'm doing that, maybe if everyone wants to just introduce themselves and their connection to Engage. Do you want to start, Trevor?
Introducing ourselves?
Just yeah.
Hi, I'm Trevor Hart at Ryerson University.
Which one I take? I'm Frederick Pronovost. I'm co-director at Réseau.
Mark Gaspar, postdoc on Engage, working with Daniel Grace at U of T, University of Toronto.
I'm covered.
Yeah.
That's literally it? Okay, thanks, Danielle. Yes. Okay, I'm not that good with technology. So this is our panel outline. Trevor, who is our fearless leader of this multi-site group, is going to talk about Engage, a little bit behind the study, as well as the frameworks, particularly as they pertain to mental health. And then Fred and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the preliminary quantitative data from the study. Chibi is one of our coordinators for the Momentum site here in Vancouver, and is far more competent than me.
I don't know where you are, but carry on.
It won't automatically switch to the slide I need now. And then Daniel and Mark are going to talk about some of the qualitative work that's been going on in the study. And then Mark's going to specifically talk about a separate grant that he got around hacking the knowledge gap for LGBTQ plus health. And then we're hoping for the rest of the time to have questions and discussion. Particularly, we're really coming at quite an early stage in the at least quantitative data analysis, seeking people's feedback around what would be most helpful in your work, what would you like to see us use for your data, or use the data for, rather. So that's kind of the goal today, is to come back to you guys and get some feedback. So I'll hand it over to Trevor.
So this is just a brief overview of the Engage study. We could spend the entire session and I still wouldn't cover all the details, and I will not bore you with that level of detail. So the context, we have a lot of social factors that continue to make people more at risk for HIV infection than others, and gay men make up over half of new HIV infections. A new generation of young guys are growing up with no experience of the AIDS crisis, and young guys are are a large share of infections. It's debatable whether our young guys are an increasing share, but it's certainly a high number in Toronto. HIV testing is becoming easier, and we're able to detect HIV sooner, and early effective treatment has been shown to increase health outcomes and to significantly lower chances of HIV transmission. Another thing that we know is that PEP and PrEP and other new options are there to prevent HIV, and they're changing the way that we in the community think about safer sex. So we have a multifaceted study that's going to try to address many of the things that are actually occurring as we kind of move into this era of biomedical-based HIV prevention. It's a multifaceted research project, and you can see it's got multiple funding sources. It focused on the health of gay, bi, and queer men, including trans men and other men who have sex with men. And it's happening in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Each city has its own community engagement committee. And the reason why we say that is just a community advisory board is because we want to actually engage, not just have them advise us, and then we say, screw you, we don't care. But we actually want to work actively with the community, although a majority of our members are actually members of our own community. We're here as gay, bi, queer men and our amazing allies. That's not enough, and we want to make sure that we have engagement both with our community-based organizations and people who represent other parts of our diverse communities. And it uses something called respondent-driven sampling, which is a social network based chain recruitment. So it's not, if you've ever heard of snowball recruiting, it's not quite like that. We actually will know who's recruiting whom, and we'll actually be able to try to create a more representative sample by weighting folks in different ways, or less or more based upon the social networks and who they're able to recruit, which will account somewhat for the fact that we won't necessarily get everybody in the study. We can actually take a look at underrepresented groups and see if we kind of change how we kind of weight their responses, if that helps for us to get a more representative sample. So we've got a mixed methods cross-sectional study. We actually have 2 time points, so it's really almost, it's not, it just has some cohort study components, but really it's 2 time points, at least in Toronto and in Montreal. In Vancouver, we're working off from the Momentum study, which many of you guys know in Vancouver, which has a wonderful resource of an actual cohort study. We also have research capacity building to train engaging and emerging GBMSM researchers, gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men researchers, and of course community engagement. So our study is a big study. We're going to have over 2,000 guys, and hopefully at 2 different time points at minimum. That's exciting. What's nice about it is that it'll be one of the only studies that's actually has biological outcome data. We'll actually have HIV testing data. We'll actually have STI data. We'll actually know who's contracting STIs and who isn't. We'll have a little bit of a sense of HIV recent incidents. So we'll have some evidence of this, but you know, it does have limitations. We only have 2 time points, at least in 2 of our cities. We've got one nice thing is, just like the advanced collaboration, the alliance, we're actually trying to overcome that kind of city-state mentality that, you know, each city is almost competing against other cities, and to work together on building on infrastructures like M-Track that existed before. And we're not only looking at individual behaviors, but we're looking at community and societal factors that affect our health. We're not just assuming that people, if they're not doing something that public health authorities like, that it's their fault. We're actually taking a look at things like, do people have access to health resources? Do they have access to clinics? How comfortable do they feel accessing clinics? What kind of problems have they had dealing with homophobia or heterosexism or lack of access or economic access? We'll be able to take a look at many of those factors. And we are paying extra attention to ensure that the experiences of trans guys and guys of color are included. But we do have a challenge in that we're doing this in English, except in Montreal. So that's already a limitation, and we want to just name it out loud. Especially in Toronto, where about half the guys half the people speak another language other than English at home, we recognize that that's a profound limitation. In order for us to do this really well, we'd probably want to have in Toronto the study in about 10 different languages, which would add an additional probably 2 years to our study, and maybe another $500,000 that we had decided we just didn't have the ability to do that. We also need to rethink our language regarding safer sex and designing a survey and expanding this beyond a focus on condoms, because most of the research has all been kind of condom, and we live in a much more complex world. So this gives you an example of what we're asking people. So in case you have ever received a study voucher, please encourage participating and encourage others to participate. In Vancouver and in Toronto, we're still recruiting, and we are eager to get that done. A bigger city doesn't necessarily mean that it's easier to recruit. Sometimes it can be harder if it's diffuse. So if you ever get a voucher, please help raise awareness about our study. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about syndemic factors. So basically, if we think about syndemics, some of you probably already know about this, but some of you may not, so please bear with me in case you already know about this. This is when there are 2 or more overlapping epidemics, or overlapping, you could even call them psychological or psychosocial problems, that each kind of combine to create a bigger problem, and they're all interrelated with each other. So for example, if we know if guys, let's say, use multiple substances, that there's not necessarily a problem in and of itself, but it's also associated with being more depressed. which is also associated with being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I'm not saying that just because you have one of those things, that means that you have one of the others. What I am saying is that at a population level, all of these things are associated with each other, and the more of those psychological concerns that people might have or potential problems, the more likely they are also to have HIV across a variety of studies. And so that's one of the frameworks that we're looking at, and we're taking a look at how mental health and substance use potential problems, how they're associated with each other, and in turn how they might be associated with the HIV or STI epidemics. This gives you an example of what it looks like from a study that we did just recently, where you can see here if somebody has one psychosocial problem, they're much less likely to have had condomless anal sex with someone of an opposite or unknown HIV status. And this is actually a relatively recent study. But again, it doesn't address for all the issues around PrEP and treatment as prevention. We don't know some of these data. We will have these data from Engage, though, and we will be able to answer these questions and to know how are things in this much more complex world that we live in, where people can have sex with someone of an opposite HIV status, and they might be engaging in safer sex. So we want to know more about that. There's also the minority stress model. So basically in the minority stress model, that's another mental health framework, we know that people in general, community, everyone experiences stress. Stress regarding finances, stress regarding their work, stress regarding their commute, stress regarding their family, stress regarding their relationships. And everyone comes with their own set of family background problems, you know, things that you grew up with. Maybe your family was neglectful on certain things. Maybe they weren't so good at expressing emotions. Maybe you didn't feel as supported. Maybe there were abuse or neglect experiences. But for gay, bi, queer, and two-spirit people, they may experience all those general stressors and the family diatheses or vulnerabilities, but we also have to deal with the effects of homophobia, and for trans as well as for transphobia. So we have additional stresses that we have to deal with that people in the straight community don't necessarily have to deal with. And a great example of that is, you know, as I'm landing on the plane, we're going to the, you know, the summit, and there's, you know, gay, oh, that's so great, we're all able to meet together as gay, bi, queer men. I see something where I'm like, I'm just reading it, you know, in the airport where it's like, oh, look, another homophobic attack. Well, what was the couple's crime? I'm not sure if they were just sitting next to each other or, God forbid, holding hands or something like that. But like, these are things that we actually have to pay attention to in our community about like when is it safe for us to be out, and how out are we comfortable being, and what's okay to do and what's not okay. We have to deal with that kind of concerns about concealment and when are things safe and when are things not safe, even if we're completely out in our own personal lives. So this is the minority stress model, that we experience added stressors. And this is not unique to gay, bi, queer men. Many of us are from more than one minority group or group that suffers from discrimination and violence. And so for folks that experience more than one of those, that could actually experience double minority stress. And we'll be taking a look at some of that in our study for gay, bi, queer men of color. So we're also taking a look at how, in the minority stress model, at how some of these stressors that are kind of more not unique to you personally, like discrimination or violence. So for example, that couple, it wasn't that person knew them personally that was violent against them. And for me, I didn't know those people either, but I also had increased my concerns about discrimination or violence, and how those are associated with what they call proximal stressors in that model, which are the stresses about how it affects you personally, having lower self-esteem, having internalized homophobia, being concerned about how much you need to conceal yourself as a gay, bi, queer man or not. How passing are you? Do you want to be passing? Are you, even if you're not trying to be passing and you're trying to like say, hey, here's who I am, this is who I am, to still being somewhat concerned that it could lead to negative outcomes even as you try to promote a sense of pride and well-being. And in turn, those internal stressors, which they call proximal stressors, are associated with poor outcomes like poor mental health and poor sexual health. And most of this research comes out of the US, but we've done some of this work in Toronto and found a pretty much identical pattern of findings. So this is a complicated model. I'm not going to walk you through the whole thing, but in case you are kind of interested, you'll see that it is more complex than what I've presented, and they take a look at how much we identify with our identity, what our minority status is, some of the stresses, and whether I mentioned that are more external, what they call distal in the middle of the model, or proximal, things that are closer to you, more on the inside. But it also does take a look at coping and social support and community support. So it's not only an individualist kind of model, but it's also support that we get in the community as well as oppression that we get from inside or outside of the community. So it's more complex than what I've presented, but we will be taking a look at a lot of these things in the ENGAGE study. I'm not going to cover all this in detail. The other thing that we're looking at is a sexual health framework that builds upon a social ecological model. So yes, we're individuals. We have individual characteristics in the middle, but we also are individuals in a context. And our context is we have relationships, whether they're friendships, whether they're our work relationships, whether are romantic or sexual relationships. But in turn, those relationships exist in a community context and in turn exist in a societal context. And the health system can kind of intersect with each of those, not just individually, but kind of like how we think about the health system. You know, that's a societal context. So, for example, what's covered by, in Ontario, by what we call OHIP, some things are and some things aren't. What isn't covered? Mental health. So what isn't covered? Typically substance use treatment. So that's a societal context. So we should pay attention. It's not just affecting us as individuals, but the whole system may have some challenges or some strengths. And it might affect us differently depending on which community we live in or depending on kind of what kind of relationships we have. For example, some of you in Toronto might know about Maple Leaf Medical Clinic will provide PrEP and without question. Some of you don't know about it. How do you know about it? Relationships. So you can see how that kind of healthcare system stuff can really intersect with the relationships. So I promised I'd be quick. And so I hope I was quick enough. But we are looking at a lot of aspects of mental health and substance use and where it's a problem and where it's not a problem. In the ENGAGE study, and we're really excited about giving you some of the information that we'd like to get ourselves. We think it's time we move beyond kind of an HIV-only lens, although we were able to get this funded through an HIV-oriented funding envelope. We tend to think of our health as being much more than what virus we have or don't have, but it's in that societal context, and also just kind of repeat what I've said before, how we feel is related to how we fuck. And so we want to talk more about how we're feeling so that we can improve the health of our community.
Thanks, Trevor. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the preliminary quant data. So this is for folks that are savvy about RDS. This is unadjusted data, so this is just the crude data that we have, and we pulled it across the 3 sites that we recruit from. So Trevor talked a little bit about the responder-driven sampling. So folks would get a voucher for either as a seed, an initial participant, or from one of their contacts. And then they would come into one of the study sites, whether that be in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver. They would do their informed consent process, and then they do a self-completed computer questionnaire. So they're all reporting this to the computer. It's not face-to-face, trying to reduce social desirability and interviewer bias. And then they do a clinical study visit. So what we're focusing on in these data is this self-completed computer questionnaire. In terms of eligibility, Trevor talked a little bit about this, but just to reiterate it, this is cis and trans men aged at least 16 who reported sex with another man in the 6 months prior to survey and lived in one of the study cities. And these data that we're showing you go from February 2017 to August 2018. So fresh data. Which is why we don't have adjusted statistics. And thank you, Paul is here from our data team, and Justin, who are the people who pulled this all together, especially Justin. So thank you. So a little bit of demographics. That figure doesn't look great, but so we have right now 1,937 participants as of the end of August. The majority of those are coming from Montreal, who completed their recruitment earlier this year. So we have smaller proportions from Vancouver and Toronto. In terms of current employment, 70% of people were currently employed, and then this figure shows the distribution around income in 3 different categories. But we also, one of the things I like in this study is that we also ask people around financial strain. So as opposed to just asking people what they make, knowing that cost of living varies quite extensively across the country, we ask people a series of different items that relate to stressors related to finances. So we asked folks how hard it was to find money for an unexpected expense if one came up, such as an expensive medical bill or otherwise. And so this is the kind of distribution of folks in terms of that piece. And I think we wanted to present this a little bit because it will connect a bit with what Mark and Daniel talk a little bit about. But I think this piece around income, finance, stress, class is quite important. And I think we've got some data that we'll be able to play with on the quantitative side to help tease out, I think, some of the things that the qualitative data has really helped illuminate. So in terms of some of the mental health data, this was just a simple one-item question asking people to self-rate their mental health. And what you can see here is about half of folks indicate that they would rate their mental health as excellent or very good. Another quarter of folks would say good, but that's a quarter of folks that are really saying fair or poor. We also asked or got folks to complete some validated scales in various mental health measures. So this is the hospital anxiety and depression scale. So they would answer a number of different items related to depressive symptoms and ask whether they were experiencing those or not. And what we find here is that about a quarter of folks report on this scale as having mild, moderate, or severe depressive symptoms. And then in terms of anxiety, about half of folks indicate mild, moderate, or severe anxiety symptoms. So during quite a significant proportion of the guys that are coming through the study. And then I think I'm going to hand it over to Fred at this point.
Thank you, Nate. First, before I begin, I just want to thank the Engage team. I think this is a great research project. I tend to see it like a community-based research. Kind of. At Réseau, we've been really involved with the Engage team in Montreal and nationally, and I felt like they were considering us like equals, so this is really something that meant to us to this kind of research, and I feel we were respected in that, and it may be why in Montreal we were successful with the RDS collection data. My team were excited about this project, and the Engage team were excited, so I think we put it out of work so thank you guys. You're awesome. And thank you, Nate, for the great work. I'm reporting the data here, but Nate did the job to put that on the PowerPoint. So okay, so we had some question about recent mental health cascade. So if I understood correctly, is someone felt the need and we are seeing those who receive the services. So 19% of those guys who felt the need did not see or talk to mental health counselor or goes to mental health services. We don't know why, but it may be related to different stuff. We also asked some question about the ease of current access. So basically 28% of the sample had difficulties to find access to a mental health provider. And for the recent provider use for mental health or in health in general, for mental health, family doctor were the first to come up, and family doctors are not always the best choice for mental health, so it may be a problem on that. And we also asked about the cost of last mental health services. And I was a bit surprised that 67% were fully reimbursed. So, but it may be linked that the service provider was the physician. Because and I'm eager to see what is the distribution between each of the province and region, because most of the time in Montreal we see that cost is a big challenge for access in mental health. 33% had to pay for mental health services, and mostly the average of the services was around $50 to $149. In terms of lifetime diagnosis, 35% have been diagnosed with anxiety disorder, 22% stress-related disorder, and 80% major depression. And you see the other down there. And in terms of suicidality, it's hard to say, isn't it? And self-harm, you have 17, almost 18% ever hurt self on purpose during their lifetime. And 33% never even thought about suicide, but 67% of the sample have thought and goes further to take action, just planning or attempt and hope to die. In terms of childhood trauma, which was not surprising, but to see it on paper is kind of like, it's something. 33% of the sample experience at least touch during their sexual, their childhood. It's not exclusive, no? Okay. You see that the other kind of sexual abuse are pretty high too. The Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale, I learned, I didn't know that scale were existed, and that's great. So almost 80% of the sample feel that they are able to adapt if a change occurs in their life, and 72% can bounce back. And I want to be sure I'm understanding bounce back is like they are able to adapt to it. Okay, good. There's some expression in English I wasn't sure I was understanding very well. In terms of prevention, 86% heard of PrEP, and this is something we really have to work. Among those persons who knows about HIV, about undetectable viral load, only 60% believe that it's working.
That's amongst all people.
Okay, that's among all the people. But still, I really feel that this is something in our work in the futures that we have to do something about that, and it's probably related to stigma as well. Only 20% practice viral load sorting in the past 6 months. That's it. I'll hand it to Mark.